Um, our webinar today, and thank you all for coming, is about the Arctic. And we ran an article back in December about 30 less traveled places for women to visit. And it was all about places, new places to explore, places that our writers have been to and our travel experts. And one of our wonderful partnerships is with Wild Women Expeditions. And Franny, I never can say your last name, so you'll have to help me.
Bergschneider.
Schneider is here with us today to answer all your questions about the Arctic, because it really is one of those less traveled places that is so close to North America for us to explore. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the Arctic, answer your questions, and which I encourage you to put in the chat as well. Before we get started, I just want to do a land acknowledgement. Just let me find it. And, you know, Journey Woman, we try to be a safe place for all women. And if I can, where everyone feels welcome. And we're committed to creating a safe place with the intention of helping to unearth the true value of each person who joins this community. We wish to acknowledge that the land we are standing on today is the traditional territory of many nations. And we wish to acknowledge and thank the first peoples of this territory and other Indigenous peoples for sharing this land with us so that we can continue our work today. And I, of course, am, you may not realize, in Italy at the moment. So it's evening here. And I've been in Italy for the last 2 weeks or so. I'm traveling in the off season and having all kinds of adventures here, which you'll read about in our newsletter tomorrow. But I've been thinking a lot about this year because it is Journey Woman's 30th anniversary, which is a really exciting time for us. 30 years of talking about women's solo travel. And as you all know, Evelyn Hannon is the one who started that in 1994. So she produced the first Journey Woman printed newsletter in 1994, and then she went online in 1997. And here we are 30 years later, still talking about women's travel and talking about solo travel and the adventure of travel. So as I said, tonight we're starting off talking about the Arctic, but we also have some other webinars planned coming up in February. We're going to be talking about Europe, and that is on February 27th. And then in March, we're going to be talking about transformational travel and wellness travel. And at the end of January, we also are hosting a webinar on human trafficking, which may not be our favorite topic to talk about, but it's an important issue for us to be aware of. So Wild Woman is actually participating in that, along with Ally Group, Tracy Breeden from our advisory council, and the Code. So that will be another really interesting discussion at the end of January. So I hope you're all putting in where you're from in the chat section and letting us know what you'd like to learn today. But I want to start by welcoming Franny. And Franny, maybe tell us a little bit about you and your polar expertise, if I can call it that.
Totally. Thanks, Caroline. Well, hello, I'm Franny, and I work for Wild Women Expeditions as the program and operations manager. I am based and live in Toronto, Canada. So hello from that part of the world. And my love for the Arctic really started when I was a young girl. I would dream about the Arctic, and I was a canoe guide, and my goal was to take kids to the Arctic on a canoe trip. And so I started my expedition in a canoe, and my first time in the Arctic was paddling actually in a canoe with 16-year-olds from a lake in northern Manitoba, and we paddled to Churchill on Hudson Bay. And I can remember just having the best day of my life. I saw a mom and a cub polar bear on the shores of Hudson Bay, just as the river is kind of expanding, becoming more of an estuary leading into Hudson Bay. And we paddled out into Hudson Bay to make our way to Churchill, and we're paddling through just like a huge pod of hundreds and hundreds of beluga whales. And I can remember thinking, this is the best day of my whole life. And that kind of was the beginning of my expedition travel. After that, I worked for Cork Expeditions for about 8 years as an expedition guide and coordinator. And I've probably spent about a year and a half living on an expedition ship in the Arctic. I've spent a bunch of other years in the Antarctic, but that's for a different story time. But about a year and a half on an expedition ship in the Arctic.
You must really love cold weather because I mean, I heard today was 45 below in Calgary and parts of Canada. Are you a cold weather person? You must be.
I just love, my favorite thing is to wake up early and go outside and explore. And if it's cold, I believe in layers and dressing appropriately. But the cool thing about traveling to the Arctic and also Antarctica is when you're in Antarctica, you're in the austral summer. So it could be plus 15 there, while here, so all everybody down there is saying, oh, haha, a bunch of suckers in Calgary today. Because it's not minus 40 down there right now. And when you're traveling to the Arctic, you're traveling in the boreal summer, usually on an expedition vessel. It might be a little bit different if you go to Iceland or Greenland, or Arctic Canada in the winter to do dog sledding or for the aurora borealis. But if you're there in the summer, it's the boreal summer, and I've been out and about when it's 18, 20 degrees.
Mm.
So,
Well, that's better than probably where most of us are now, I would think.
and that's in the summer. So it'd be probably 40 degrees plus, and you're going up there, you might get anywhere between 0 and 20, depending on where
Yeah.
you are and what time of year it is, for sure.
Yeah. You and I have talked a lot about the Antarctic in the past. And so one of my first questions when we started talking about this was how is it different? How is the Arctic different? And maybe you could just explain what the countries are, because there's quite a few countries that are encompassed in the Arctic Circle.
Totally. Yes. I'll start with Antarctica. So Antarctica is a continent of land, and it's surrounded by water. And of course, it's a different ecosystem, and that includes different animals that live there. They have penguins, which is the only flightless bird in the world. They have a lot of Antarctic seals and different seabirds down there, such as albatross. And there's no indigenous population in Antarctica, so
Right.
it's a continent dedicated to peace, science, and sustainability, which is very amazing. It's a unique place in the world for sure. And when you compare it to the Arctic is essentially a body of water, the Arctic Ocean, that is frozen. So you have that multi-year sea ice over the North Pole, and that's the ecosystem that really, really feeds the world's climate. It really is. They say that the poles are the world's air conditioner. Um, Most of the oxygen we breathe comes from those delicate ecosystems in the north and in the south. And in the Arctic, you have that frozen ice, that all that phytoplankton is living on at the bottom, and around it you have different pieces of land. So the land is around the ocean, and that's super unique because in that way, the Arctic, we have the circumpolar Arctic, and so there's not one country you visit to visit the Arctic like you would for Antarctica. You could explore Alaska, or you could explore Canada, or you could explore Russia, Iceland, Greenland, Norway. There's just so many options to choose from.
And why do you think, you know, when we look at all the travel opportunities available to us as women, why do you think it's important for women to go to the Arctic?
Oh, that's such a great question. I've been reflecting and meditating on this one a lot because I think it's one of the important ones. But I mean, I speak as a woman, not for all women, but I think that as women who are what am I trying to say? If you're socialized to be a woman in today's world, there is a lot of invisible labor that we're responsible for. And the women that I talk to, we similarly have an active overthinking mind. And so if you resonate with that, or if that's something that you feel like applies to you, I find that it can be really beneficial to carve out time for yourself, to rest and reflect. And the Arctic is such a great place to do it, especially on an expedition ship, because one, the internet is not great. So you can have that digital detox.
Yeah.
You can really carve out time to be with yourself on the land in the quiet. You can really get that night, that time for reflection. And who you are when you visit the Arctic is not necessarily the person you are when you're leaving. So I think that's super interesting. I also think it's a place that um, in colonial history, it has been viewed through a male lens. So there were a lot of male explorers, British explorers, Norwegian explorers, to name a few. Franklin is his failed expedition is pretty infamous, and Roald Amundsen. It's a lot of male exploration through this colonial lens, and I think it's important for women to take up space in those in in those circumstances. Um, and also what's so amazing is that when you go and visit the Arctic, you're seeing these female expedition staff and expedition leaders. And I can't tell you how many times women have come up to me and said, this, like watching you drive this Zodiac through our surf in South Georgia or wherever we are, has been very empowering for myself. And if they're with their grandkids or their kids, it's such a special gift to give someone, because you know that anything is possible when you can see somebody do something amazing like that you never thought was possible. And when you visit the Arctic, the other thing that you get access to is you'll be visiting communities. And so you get insight into the indigenous communities and women's roles in these communities is so special. And you learn that it's these communities are completely different than North American communities. They are very matriarchal. Very women-led, very women oriented, a lot of roles and response. Like women have a lot of power in Arctic communities, which is really amazing. Their role is really specific and needed. And it's also amazing to spend time with these women and share experiences and hear stories of their lives and their mothers' lives and their grandmothers' lives, and really what they've experienced and how things have changed over the course of just a few hundred years even.
Franny, do you find that they welcome tourists? Do they want people to come and visit, or are we in any way imposing on their life?
Yeah, I think it depends on the size of ship that is going to visit these communities, and it depends on um like the intention of the visit. And I mean, people are wanting to, a lot of artists live in the north, and if you're a tourist on a ship and you visit the North, it can be easy to buy really amazing artwork and feed someone's family potentially. So, excuse me. Um, I think the intention of why you're going there is important. And
Absolutely.
really quickly, people that are welcoming you can understand what that is if you're looking to connect with them and hear about their lives and hear about their stories. A lot of the visits are not even about purchasing artwork, but experiencing a cultural educational show. So, for example, in Mitamatalik, which is formerly known as Pond Inlet on Baffin Island, there's a, a great cultural show that you visit their community center and they put on a performance basically for you, and you get to connect with the people and hear some throat singing and some Arctic games, which is quite amazing.
And I know we're all thinking about sustainability, both in terms of the ships and also just in terms of impact on the environment. What's your sense of that as it relates to the Arctic? And actually, people may even want to know what you think about the Antarctic.
Yeah. And I think there's definitely a way to do it in a more sustainable lens. If you're traveling on a small ship, for example, that would have a lower carbon footprint. Um, and there's also many, many benefits to traveling on a smaller ship as well.
Mm-hmm.
If you're on a larger ship, well, so when you're in the Arctic, there's a governing body called IACO, and it basically is the Arctic Association for Cruise Operators in the North, and they have a whole system of rules and regulations that if an operator is operating in the North, they have to meet these rules and regulations, and the framework is around protecting wildlife and protecting historical sites. So there's lots of guidelines around that, as well as how many people can land on shore. So in
Mm-hmm.
Svalbard, for example, if that's where you choose to explore the Arctic, you can't land more than 100 people on the shore at a time. And so you're limited in that way. Whereas if the ship is over 100 people, you're limited to the time. You get less time on the shore because you can't have the full roster of people on at one time. Whereas if you're on a smaller ship, you can you can land everybody at once.
And I
It's
imagine the ports, you're going to smaller places, smaller communities with a
Yeah,
smaller ship as well.
in Canada and Greenland, that 200 passenger regulation is not affected in Canada and Greenland as much as it is in Svalbard. Um, and there's other regulations such as how close you can get to wildlife and how to handle sites that you're landing at that have historical artifacts. Yeah, and in the South, it's similar. There's a governing body called IATO, which is essentially the Association of Antarctic Tour Operators, and it's essentially doing a similar thing, governing how many people can be on a site at one time and who can be there. There's a ship scheduler, um, and how close you can get to wildlife, and then also they have a lot of biosecurity regulations. They don't want anybody bringing in any
Yeah,
invasive.
yeah, it's probably like the Galapagos, right? It's quite
Exactly.
strict. Yeah. What,
Even
tell us how do you get there? Because I think I know you and I talked about this. I'm like, okay, so I get on a plane and I go where? Because you have to fly, obviously, but where do you go? And maybe explain it in the context of some of your trips.
Yeah, totally. So our trips are expedition-based trips on a small vessel, and um, the ones in the high Arctic are hard. I mean, if you were to fly to the high Arctic on your own, it could cost you up to $6,000, and there's no guarantee that you'd get there in a certain amount of time. Some of these flights get postponed and delayed, and it could take days to get where you want to go. So we have on offer charter flights that are add-ons to the package. And so for example, our Heart of the Arctic tour, which starts in Greenland and ends in Resolute, you would actually start the trip in Toronto. So all you would have to do is make your way to Toronto, and then we would get you on this charter flight, and the charter flight would just take you directly to, oh my gosh, the name is not in my mind. It would take you to, not Ida Quarterman. Oh my gosh, how can it's like, when you know a word.
Don't worry, we're going to put up a slide in a minute and then it'll all come back.
God.
But
Crazy.
this is like a long, like, okay, so you arrange all the flights basically so that we don't have to worry about getting up there because it's a long way up. It's not like you could take a boat or drive or I
No.
don't mean to sound silly, but
Yeah.
we're talking about a long trip.
Yeah, if you were to try to fly to Greenland, you would have to, most people would fly to Europe, to either to Denmark or maybe France, and then you would fly from there to Greenland. So it would be like thousands of dollars for that ticket. And exactly like how many hours is that? You fly there, you spend a night, and then you spend another day getting over to Greenland. Whereas with the charter packages, it's just a direct flight from Toronto to Greenland. And it's just about a 6-hour flight.
Right, right. And just going back to the ships for a minute, you're partnered with Adventure Canada,
That
which
is,
does these ships. And what is the size and the capacity, the passenger capacity of these ships versus, what you might call a large ship?
yeah. So the ship that they're using, the Ocean Endeavor, it actually has a capacity of, I think, 350 people, but they don't put that many people on it. They put the max capacity for an Arctic voyage. Their Arctic voyages are in Greenland and Canada, so the max capacity on land doesn't affect those trips. And they have a max capacity on that vessel of 200 passengers. Whereas if there's, I think, Princess Cruise Lines does a Northwest Passage trip, but that ship has like thousands of people, and you wouldn't, in that scale of ship, you wouldn't be leaving the vessel. You would just be having a ship-based cruise.
Wow, that's a big difference if you can't really set foot on the land and talk to people.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. And there's
interesting.
tons of benefits to the smaller ship as well. Community oriented. The excursions are faster. I mean, leaving the ship is faster, so you can spend more time outside in the communities or on land. Um, you get to know your fellow travelers, things like that.
That's great. I want to take some questions that are in the chat. So I'm just going to take a quick look through and see if there are any questions that we could answer that we haven't answered yet. So if you do have questions, please do put them in. I know there was a question about how to get there, and I think we've answered that. We're going to talk about packing in just a minute and what to bring. We talked about Arctic and our Antarctic. We talked about the ecosystems. Maybe you could touch a little bit more. I know we have some photographs of wildlife, but what are some examples of the kind of wildlife you can see in the Arctic that you can't see anywhere else in the world?
Oh gosh, yes. Well, the main big one is the polar bear. The polar bear, and seeing it on ice too, because a polar bear, amazingly enough, is a marine mammal. So all other bears are terrestrial mammals, meaning that the main majority of their life is spent on land. They're a terrestrial mammal just like us. Whereas a polar bear, they're a marine mammal, so they spend the majority of their time on the sea ice, which is the ocean or water-based. There's the polar bear. And so it's just amazing seeing a bear on its natural habitat. you can kind of understand, you start to see its behavior and learn about its behavior and what it eats and where it eats and when it eats and how much it has to eat to sustain that fat that it needs to stay warm in the cold weather. Yeah, and a lot of our trips actually, oh, and there's a narwhal, the unicorn of the sea. I actually have a really funny story about a narwhal. So my first whale experience, as I told you about, was this pod of beluga whales. And it was just the most magical experience I've had. And when I started working in the Arctic, every year since then, I have had really special experiences with beluga whales. They're more active at the surface. They're easier to spot. They're they have behaviors that allow you to observe them in the wild. But I was obsessed with this narwhal, seeing a narwhal. And I was lucky enough to be on a voyage in Baffin Bay in 2019, I think, and we came across a huge group, like about a pod of about 200 narwhal.
Oh my
And
goodness.
it was amazing. I was like, here's the moment. And I love narwhal so much. I think they're so special and they're very hard to see in the water. This shot is an anomaly. It's so hard to see the tooth coming out of the front of their nose or the front of their rostrum, excuse me. And they're very skittish because they've been hunted so aggressively for this prized tusk or tooth at the front of their head. And I just thought that was such a good metaphor for life. You know, you think that you need to be seeing this one thing, that this magical creature is it drove me to kind of, I was driven to see it and observe it in the wildlife. But yet this whale that I kept having these experiences with was really the most magical, special whale.
Mm,
A good metaphor for life. Often what's in your life, it's hard to sometimes appreciate until you have that perspective. Oh, and this is another of my favorite creatures. It's called a walrus. And so you can see it has those two long teeth, those two tusks. And the male walrus have just very large tusks, whereas the females have smaller tusks. This would be about not a very old male, probably a younger or a juvenile male. They start to get this really robust neck, fat and skin, and they're like a creature from a sci-fi novel, I think, or a sci-fi movie. But they're amazing. They are a diving species, and they have this high piston suction with their mouth. And so they're diving to the bottom of the benthic layer and they're actually like with their mouth, they're sucking clams out of individual clam shells, and they eat thousands of pounds of clams a day. So just think about this creature diving down to the bottom of the sea, getting to the benthic layer, sucking out clams. And they've biopsied these creatures. They've cut them open and looked in their stomach to examine the contents, and they don't find one iota of clamshell. Isn't that
mm,
amazing? This creature
wow.
is exactly how to suck this clam out of the bivalve and not retain any of that sharp shell. Just amazing.
Let's see what other photos we have here. This looks like
Whale.
a
This is a humpback
whale.
whale.
Yeah.
So this is an interesting photo because humpbacks are not necessarily unique to the Arctic. You can find them across the whole world, basically. And you can see them in the Arctic as well. The main species of whales that are unique to the Arctic would be that mysterious narwhal, number one. Beluga is an ice species or an Arctic species, and the bowhead whale is the third Arctic species. And curiously enough, all of those Arctic whales do not have a dorsal fin. So probably because of evolution, they haven't needed it as they've been traversing these ice laden waters. It's just probably become irrelevant for them.
Hmm. So this is the ship.
This is the ship. This is the Ocean Explorer. Excuse me. Ocean Endeavor. Excuse me. This is the Ocean Endeavor, and this is when you go on an expedition. What I love about a ship-based expedition is you unpack in your room. You don't, so once you unpack, you don't have to pack again. And
Yeah.
you're on this voyage sometimes for 10 up to 20 days, depending on which voyage you choose. And you just move into your room and then you move with the ship and you're exploring and you're moving and you're going to all these different special places. Yet every night you return to your room and you don't have to unpack or pack in the morning. It's so special.
And you get a new view every day.
Exactly. A new view every day. You really become comfortable with the ship as well. It's very nice. This is a group of women. I think this is a community called Sissamute, which is the artist capital of Greenland. You can see in Greenland how there's all these houses that are different colors. It's very picturesque. Oh, I love this photo. This is the photo that we took on our Heart of the Arctic expedition. So an expedition that went from Baffin Island down into Ungava Bay and then across to Greenland. And excuse me, I'm just going to take some water. What I love about this photo is it shows how when you're booking this trip, but you're in a small group within a larger group, but you're not alone. Even if you choose to travel alone, for example, you're not going with a partner or a friend or a child or a sister or anything, you're choosing to solo travel, yet you still have this comfort of like-minded women as your group. And I love it. As I think if I identify as being an introvert. I have some extroverted qualities for sure, but I'm an introvert. And one of the things I love about traveling with wild women, especially on an expedition, is that we have arranged seating at the dining room table. So every morning you wake up and you go out and you have your adventure, and you might have it with a couple of other wild women, but every lunch and every dinner we come together and we sit at these tables and we debrief our experiences together. And so it's not necessarily about meeting, you're not meeting hundreds of new people. You're meeting this, and this is quite a large group. You're meeting maybe like 20 women, and you just get to deepen into relationship with each other over the course of 10 to 20 days. And it's not so much, I mean, you have those initial conversations, but then it can start to become about debriefing experiences and really having like heart-based conversations, connecting with each other. And really when you connect with each other, you connect with the place as well. It's really a special
And
experience.
yeah, in this picture, I mean, it looks like quite an age range too. There's nobody that's excluded. It's pretty inclusive of age. What about accessibility on this kind of trip? What's that like?
Do you mean in terms of like fitness, in terms of fitness,
Yeah,
or
like can anybody go on this? Do you need a certain level of fitness, or if you're in a wheelchair, can you go? Like how does it work?
well, a certain level of fitness is beneficial because you are living on a ship, and so
Mhm.
there's a certain level of balance that you need to have. You are leaving the ship if there's an expedition or an excursion planned for that day. You're leaving the vessel on a small gangway, which are steps over the ocean, and you're making your way from the steps to the Zodiac. You'll have help of the sailors, of course, but it's beneficial to have a certain level of balance, a certain level of core strength, and also knowing that there are people there to help support you through those kind of more um, delicate maneuvers of getting on the Zodiac and getting off the Zodiac. So it's not the be all, especially when you're doing these excursions, there's different hikes that you can go on, there's different hiking levels. So there's like the max fastest hard hike, which probably about 10 people go on, but then you go back from there. So then there's like a medium fast hike, there'll be a medium hike, there'll be a contemplative hike, and then there'll also be a beachcombing hike. So there's really an activity for everyone.
Different levels of activity. Yeah.
Yes.
And also, I think, I mean, I've been on 2 Wild Women trips that have involved hiking and walking. I mean, this is about getting out, getting physical. You are a women's adventure company. In fact, the largest women's adventure company in the world, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Based in Canada.
Based in Canada, yes. And we are outdoorsy, experience-based women. But I was lucky in 2022. I was on the Inca Trail track, and there were women of all different abilities. And it's just wonderful how if there's someone who's struggling a little bit more or is a little bit slower, that women tend to generally be compassionate to one another and supportive, and you really form a team and support each other.
Let's just talk quickly about the trips you have coming up, and then we'll take some questions if we haven't answered them by now. Whoops, let me go back to just going to share the screen one more time so you can just tell us about what Wild Woman has coming up.
Yeah, love to.
Oh, and there's maps. So there we go. You can remember the names of the cities now.
Yes. Kangerlussuaq. Yes, that's it. It's so funny. I probably said that place 200 times, and just the brain is a funny thing. Excuse me. So this is a trip, part of the Arctic. I was on this trip in 2022, excuse me. And this is a wonderful trip. As you can see, it leaves in Iqaluit and it ends in Kangerlussuaq in Greenland. And of course, bringing it back to those charter flights. So you would actually meet the group in Toronto for this one. And there would be a charter flight up to Iqaluit. And then at the end, you'd be ending in Kangerlussuaq, for example. You'd be ending in Kangerlussuaq, and then there would be a charter flight to take you back to Ottawa. So you would have really accessible cities where you would be meeting the group, and you wouldn't have to worry about getting to those really remote places. But this trip is very special. It begins in Iqaluit. You go down to the southern tip of Baffin Island, and you explore these little communities called Kimmirut and Kingate. Kingate is formerly known as Cape Dorset, so the artist's capital of Baffin Island, where there's that world-renowned print-making facility. And exploring these 2 communities is so special because not very many ships go to these places, and so you really get a very remote, like kind of exclusive experience, because when I was in Kingate and Kimmirut hadn't seen people in 5 years. There hadn't been a ship that came through there in 5 years. And it was in the middle of, or it was at the end of COVID. So that would have affected it, but certainly not 5 years. And then you go down into Ungava Peninsula and you hike and do some Zodiac cruising, lots of great hiking there, lots of bird life. We saw some really amazing bird cliffs there. And then you head over to Nuuk, which is the capital of Greenland and the shopping capital of the world, in my opinion. It's so amazing for for Kiviat. I don't know if there's any textile or fabric junkies out there, but I love wool, and Kiviat is a magical wool. It's the underbelly of a muskox, kind of like that really fluffy, like winter wool. And they spin it into this really fine wool that's about $100 for a skein, so it's kind of like the Mercedes-Benz of wool. And it's the softest and it's the warmest wool in the world. So if you could get some skeins of wool there, or you can, I have a hat that I bought, oh gosh, probably about 8 years ago now. And the hat, it was $250, but let me tell you, it's the hat that I've probably worn this hat 2,000 times. So I think it's paid for itself, but it's so special.
Oops. So Greenland and wild Labrador.
Greenland.
And notice these are all 2025 trips. So you're booking a long way out, aren't you?
Yeah, we find that people like to plan these bigger Arctic trips because it's sure, maybe you would go to the Arctic spontaneously, but because of those flights we were talking about, that they're harder to get to, they're harder to kind of find your way to the place that you need to be. We find that people plan these trips well ahead of time. Plus they're longer trips, so people need to make sure that they have that time if they're working. But certainly if you wanted to travel in 2024, we do have some trips available for you to travel on. We just wanted to focus on 2025. Yeah. And so this trip is Greenland and Wild Labrador. I haven't been on this trip. I would love to go on this trip. Actually, I haven't. This is the part of the Arctic for me that's kind of missing, that Labrador coast. It's not high Arctic, but it's in the neighborhood, I guess. And so this one you start in Kangerlussuaq and you go down to Nuuk as well. So you get that southern west coast of Greenland. Lots of beautiful hikes. And this trip is in an amazing time of year because it's in the fall. So you're gonna have all this fall foliage. So really beautiful dwarf birch and willow that have turned like red, orange colors. And you're getting into the time of year when there is more night, there's darkness, and so there's the opportunity to see the aurora borealis, see those northern lights, which is really amazing. And then you finish on the coast of Labrador and Newfoundland. Lots of hiking, lots of historical sites there, and you finish in St. John's. So this one, it would finish, you would have a charter flight to Kangerlussuaq, and then you would finish in St. John's. So you could extend your voyage and do a few days getting out and about in St. John's by yourself if you would want to do that.
Beautiful part of the world there too. Okay, the Northwest Passage.
The Northwest Passage. So this one's out of the Northwest Passage in 2025. Excuse me. And such an amazing trip, the iconic route. It took explorers hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years to successfully find this route of the Northwest Passage. Many people died trying to find it. Ships still become run aground to this day. It's very shallow, and so it's very delicate. And this is great because you are either starting or finishing in Kangerlussuaq, and then so out of the north. So this one you're starting in Kugluktuk, and I believe finishing in Kangerlussuaq. And you're heading up to the north of Baffin Island to Devon Island, where there's lots of historical, like ancient Thule sites, which are like the previous people of Inuit that we previously called Thule. And you can see some winter homes there and some evidence of habitation. Lots of wildlife, lots of, again, like colonial history, Hudson Bay huts there, as well as you can see the grave sites of Franklin. And then going up into Grise Fjord and Smith Sound. So Smith Sound is an amazing place because you are so close to Greenland and you're so close to Ellesmere Island. You can literally see both Greenland and Ellesmere Island. It's the coldest place I've ever been. It was so cold that ice was forming on top of ice. It was these really beautiful formations of like ice trees on the ice. It was so cool. And it's just such a, when I landed on Ellesmere Island, it was just the coolest feeling. It feels like you're landing on the moon because not very many people get to be there. And just the energy is such a cool feeling. It's just has, what are the kids saying? Good vibrations. It has that good vibrations feeling there. It's just so cool.
That's great.
Baffin Island in Greenland. So this is an exciting trip because it's a brand new trip. And I love it because you get to go to Pangnirtung. So Pangnirtung is another Canadian Arctic community where there's lots of artists. They have a print shop there. And it's amazing sailing into this fjord. Sailing into this fjord, you sail into the fjord and then you just see this amphitheater of mountains. And Pangnirtung is just in the bowl of this mountainous amphitheater. It's quite amazing. And you'll get to go to that community and have a visit and then start the traverse across the Davis Strait and making your way to Ilulissat. Ilulissat is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's in Disco Bay, and you might have seen images of it. It's called the Ice Fjord. So it's a place that a glacier comes off the Greenlandic ice sheet and feeds into the fjord in Disco Bay near Ilulissat. And most of the ice, if not all of the ice in North America, like ice by ice, I mean glaciers, is fed from this glacier called Jakobshavn. And all the ice that you're seeing in Newfoundland, for example, would have come from this glacier.
Neat.
Yeah, but it's a fjord and it's just chock full of ice. It's so amazing. They've built a boardwalk there in Ilulissat, so you can go on this really beautiful hike, and there's a really nice new visitor center, and there's a lookout point where you can, from land, look at the fjord and see the ice, and you might even get a Zodiac cruise around that area too, to kind of cruise in and amongst the ice as well.
Okay, this is one I'm very interested in, just to let you know.
This is one that I think Jenny, our program
Sounds
director,
beautiful.
yeah, she went on this last June, and exactly, this is the trip that for some reason everyone wants to go on this trip. I think we had about 40 women on this trip. It was amazing. I mean, the Faroe Islands are really hard to get to. I think it's hard to fly there. It's hard to get there. I think I've researched it. I think you can fly to Iceland and then you can take a ferry from Iceland to the Faroe Islands. But how cool to just be on an expedition vessel, start in Scotland and make your way to Iceland and just be on this epic, really remote land. Lots and lots of really unique seabirds here. So if you're a seabird fanatic, this is just a really cool spot, a spot to spot some of them. Lots of marine mammals, lots of whales here. There's like continental shelves here, which anytime there's a continental shelf, which is like a difference in the land in the ocean, that means the water is being, there's an upwelling, and whenever there's an upwelling, that means there's lots of bio-rich waters, which attract seals, whales, birds. So lots of wildlife on this trip. And then not too many not too many expedition days in Iceland, but what a great place to end in Iceland. You could kind of, well, we actually have I'll talk about our next trip, but you could, if you didn't choose to do them back to back, you could end in Reykjavik and do kind of like a land-based trip if you wanted in Iceland. And then that feeds really well into the next slide, which is our Iceland. We have an Iceland circumnavigation trip, which we've added. So the first two trips that I talked about, they're actually back to back. So you could do them back to back, and then the middle two, you could do them back to back. And Iceland circumnavigation, we included this to add on to the Scotland Faroe Islands trip if you so wanted to do it. But I've been to Iceland before. I love Iceland. I think I've been 3 or 4 times. And my time I spent there, I toured around on land. I drove around and I got to some cool waterfalls. But the cool thing about doing it by expedition vessel is you can see the land from a different perspective. So you can often do these bird cliffs that when you see them on the land, you're looking at the birds from bird's eye view, which is not really a visually stunning way to view like a Arctic seabird colony. You want to see it from the waters, and you can just see how many birds there are. It's just such a unique view. And the other thing that you can do when you're on an expedition vessel is you can get to really unique bays and really unique waterfalls that you aren't accessible by road. So you can just be by a super unique waterfall without anybody else, well, except for your friends on the ship. But a really cool way to explore and see parts of Iceland that you don't get to when you're on the land.
And the photography looks beautiful. I mean, from the water, it would be stunning.
It's just stunning. It's
Yeah.
so, and on this one, there is the opportunity that there is a place where they do take you into the interior of Iceland. You would take a bus, and then you could still have some of the land-based opportunities.
Are excursions like that included in the cost of the trip, or how does it work with,
Yes, so
additional?
you can see on this map, and I'm going to mispronounce these communities' names. There's a bus that goes from Fjallstadion Glacier to Djúpivogur. So that would be probably a day trip. So in the morning, you would disembark the vessel either at Fjalldalsárjökull Glacier or Djúpivogur, and you would meet the ship at the other side. So, and that all day trips are included in the cost of the voyage. It wouldn't be anything extra.
Right. I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit. I know these are lovely photos, but I just want to get to the kind of the website with more information and talk about solo cabins too, because I know that's been a question here. You have a 25% off the cost right now, which is pretty incredible. And then can you explain how it works with solo cabins if you want a solo cabin?
Totally, yes. So for Arctic 2025, we have solo cabins left, and we have it's an amazing opportunity where the solo cabin is the same price as your spot in a twin berth. So it's just kind of a perk. For the same price as you would pay in a twin cabin, you would get a free solo cabin essentially. There are limited availability, so we don't have as many, but a super unique thing if you want to have your own space. I also enjoy having a roommate. There's pros and cons to both. Obviously, a solo cabin, you have your own space, but then I think it's nice to share with someone as well and kind of have someone to debrief your day with at the end of the day.
Yeah, the 2 trips that I've been on with Wild Woman, I had wonderful roommates both times, and who made the trip even more special. So, it's, uh, um, let's take some questions. What questions do folks have about the Arctic, about this trip? I know probably it's some questions on clothing. Does anyone have questions on clothing and what to pack? I
What's
know
the
I do.
what's the temperature?
All right.
That's a
I'm
great
going to take us off spotlight.
The temperature, well, since you would be going there anytime, so the season to do expedition cruising in the Arctic would be anytime starting in May to the end of October. And that is sort of like, I guess you have the end of the spring and the beginning of the fall, but the majority of that time is the boreal summer. So it would be, depending where you are and when you are, it could be anywhere from about 0 to 20 degrees.
I do know I was in Iceland in July and it was wonderful. It was in the 70s, so for 2 weeks. And so again, but Iceland isn't the real, cold part, but it was a fabulous trip.
Yeah, and often the thing about the Arctic is that there's the wind. So a day that's 10 degrees could feel like 5 or 0. I'm speaking in Celsius, pardon me, but um it could feel colder because of the wind, for example. And also if you're in the high Arctic and you're on a zodiac for a few hours and it's 7 degrees, by the end it could be feeling like it's 0 degrees because of the wind and the weather and the amount of time that you're spending outside sitting on a zodiac, for example.
And what about the food? There's a question here about the food.
Yeah, the food is
Always important.
Yeah, and we're on an expedition vessel and there's a restaurant. So you go to the restaurant for 3 meals a day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. For breakfast and lunch, it's a buffet style. So you can kind of choose your own adventure, I like to say, with food. So I usually stick to the oatmeal bar, but once in a while I might grab eggs Benedict or a piece of bacon, some bacon. They have just anything you could imagine, lots of fruit, eggs. They would have an omelet station where you could ask someone to make you your own custom-made omelet. They would have hard-boiled eggs, and for lunch, same thing. There's a really robust salad bar, and then there's a vegetarian option. There's lots of pastas available, meats available, rice available, steamed veggies, just tons of food. And then dinner is a plated dinner. Sometimes they might do a buffet depending on what the expedition is and how it fits into that, but usually it's a seated dining experience for dinner. So you'd have like a soup and or a salad and your main course and then a dessert.
Great. Well, I think, Franny, you've really opened up my eyes about what's available in the Arctic. I mean, I really didn't know about all these places and trips that were available. So thank you for educating us about that. And all of you are going to get an email with some more information on the trips and pricing, and if you want to learn more. And don't forget the 25% off, because that's a great opportunity. And it sounds like there are some trips available still this year if people want to go on trips this year to the Arctic. So lots of opportunity.
Yeah, we don't have as many of the free solos available for 2024. But we definitely have twin berths available and then lots of availability for 2025 still. So we welcome any phone calls or emails. We can help you. Well, I guess this is just, I mean, the thing is, Carolyn, we could talk for hours about the Arctic. That's the thing. And if you did decide you were curious about an Arctic trip, please call us because we can help hear what you are curious about and where you might want to visit, and then kind of whittle down what trip is right for you. Because yeah, there's a lot to talk about and a lot to hear from each individual, what your intentions are and what your needs are and wants are.
Yeah, and I think just the whole idea, at least for me, of going to some place that not many people go to, that's exciting too, because I'm kind of doing that now in the off season. There's nobody here but me in Italy in this little town, and it's really nice. You know, you get to see places kind of in a different light. So So thank you, Franny, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. And please do reach out if you'd like more information. We hope this was helpful, and I hope to see you on our upcoming webinars. Take care.
Bye.